Okay. I'm going to speak very briefly on a couple of things. I want to talk, first of all, about some principles about creating museums. And then I'm going to talk a drop about what we did in Washington and how we've created museums elsewhere and the philosophy behind it. And finally, I'm going to, because this is a European conference on museums, I'm going to tell you what we did with the memorial site at Belzec, which may serve as a model for what can be done elsewhere, because we took it from a communist-era memorial into an entire atmosphere. Let me begin by giving a couple of pieces of philosophy. The first piece of philosophy about museum making comes from the Tanakh and is said as part of the daily tefillot, which is the words from the Psalms, Al Narot Bavel Sham Yashavnu V'gam Bachinu B'Zachrenu Et Zion. From the waters of Babylon we sat and we wept as we remembered Zion. The principle behind that is the place from which you remember an event shapes how the event is remembered. So it is not merely a presentation of the past, it is a presentation of the past in relationship to the place. Place is a geographical location, and place is also a generational location in terms of the nature of the history. And therefore, if you took the Tanakh very seriously, you would say that you remember Jerusalem differently. You remember the destruction of Jerusalem differently in the waters of Babylon, by the waters of Babylon, than you might be in the ashes of Jerusalem. The place from which you remember an event shapes the event. Second principle of museum making, which is a very important principle, is that museums, at least historical museums, are storytelling institutions. And that is that they have to tell a story, and the major elements of storytelling that we have in the modern world are essentially two that we can speak about. The first is the novel, which is read in privacy, in the privacy of one's room. And the second is a movie or a television show. And what is the difference between a museum and a movie is a very simple but very basic and very essential difference. A movie has moving imagery and a captive audience. A movie, the only thing you can do in a movie is sit there or leave. Otherwise, the director has you under his control or her control as you watch the screen. It has moving imagery and a captive audience. A museum is the opposite. A museum has a moving audience and captive imagery. The imagery remains in one place, and the audience moves and chooses to see and to experience and to read and to listen and to intensely move according to its own wishes. And there is what we call a ping-pong theory of museums, in which if you design a museum so one moves from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3, there will be somebody who moves from one place to the other, back, across, in between. And you must respect that person's right to move in whatever direction they want, and you have to build the narrative in such a way that it has the power to move the audience in the audiences in the way in which you want them to move. How you build a museum, you must answer 4 very simple questions. The questions are simple, the answers are always much more complex. The questions: what, where, with what, and how. What do you have to say? Where are you going to say it? With what are you going to say it? And finally, then, what is your technique? What is your design? What is your element? What you have to say means, what is the history that you want to tell? What is the story you want to tell? And very importantly, especially with regard to the Shoah, but also with regard to the totality of Jewish history, The more personal a story, the more human a story, the more the audience identifies with it. And we have audiences today that are trained to identify with every conceivable story as long as it's accessible to them humanly. You can read things of cultures far distant from yours, but if you make it into a personal story, into a human story, the audience knows how to identify with it, knows how to experience it. And if you create it abstractly, disembodied, without any sense of the personhood or the personality in it, it becomes distant and does not grapple with the audience. So the question is, what do you have to say? Where do you have to say it is a dialogue. And the dialogue is between the event and where the event is being told. For example, in Washington, because we were building a museum to the Holocaust, we had to tell an American story. Now, we didn't have to tell an American story to reinforce the American story, because often what we did is we described it in clashing with the American story. But we had to tell what was America doing, when was America doing it, what was its response, what was known. And in fact, if you've been to Washington, we begin the transition into the museum by seeing the events of the Shoah, the events of the Holocaust through American eyes, which means we begin backwards with liberation, because that's the moment that American troops encountered the experience of the Holocaust. So we begin with their encounter with the Holocaust, then they ask the question, how could this have happened? And that gives us the capacity then to tell the story in the rest of the museum. But you must engage in a transition, and the place from which you remember it shapes the way in which you remember it. We created a museum in Skokie, Illinois. Skokie, Illinois was the site in 1977 and 78 of a tremendous controversy in the United States over whether neo-Nazis would be able to march in a community that contained 25,000 survivors. The fact that we built the museum in Skokie meant that it had to tell, as one of its very defining elements, it had to tell the story. It had to tell the story of the events of Skokie, Illinois. You didn't have to tell the story of Skokie, Illinois in Washington, D.C., but you did have to tell the story of Skokie, Illinois in Illinois. In the same way, in Jerusalem, you can end the museum with a view of Jerusalem and with a subtle sense that Israel is a response to the Shoah. And the conclusion becomes, see what has been happening in the aftermath. Elsewhere, you have an obligation to take the people and discharge them back into a world that is dissonant and different from the world in which they experienced. So the question of what do you have to tell, where are you telling it, becomes two of the questions. The third question, which is very important, is with what? And with what means, what is the materiality, what are the artifacts that you have? And increasingly, you also have to do something else. You have to imagine with what, and we spoke about it, those of you who were there last night, with what includes the testimony of survivors that is available. And I can tell you that the survivors' testimony is able to emotionally carry a museum, because it gives you access into the inner experience. If you present a railroad car as a railroad car, the power of that railroad car is the silence within the railroad car and the knowledge of the visitor that the modality of the railroad car was the movement from essentially mobile killers and stationary victims, the reversal of that metaphor to mobile victims and stationary killing centers, and the railroads became the indispensable element of that transition. But what then gives the railroad car added power, enormously added power, is if we hear from those who were in that railroad car, who can tell you what happened within the railroad car. I brought to Riga a present, which is a very short, which I can't show because I don't have access to the internet on my computer, but we'll be able to show it to you a little bit later because I have it on my iPad. but a 2-minute video clip of the murders of the Einsatz group in Latvia, which includes a commentary on what you're seeing. So we teach people by virtue of this clip how to read a visual document. How to read it, we stop the camera, we see all of the players, the killers, the victims, the bystanders. We see even the dogs of the village and the kids on top of the hill and the act of killing itself, but we stop it in such a way that you do it, and then we have access to the testimony of somebody who was inside the mass grave and emerged. And all we have to do is to show the killers in contrast to the victims, and you don't even need to present an artifact. But we now, thanks to the work of Patrick Dubois for Einsatzgruppen, have artifacts that also tell a very powerful story. What are the artifacts that Father Dubois has dug up? There are 2 artifacts that are very important. One of them are keys. Now, you don't think of keys as an artifact, but keys tell you the fact that you left your home today, you expect to return to your home, and you expect your home to be there and to be safe. The fact that you parked your car outside and took your keys, you mean when you leave this room, you expect to go out to your car and you expect your car to be there, therefore it is safe. And the fact that victims went to their death with keys tells you what their attitude was the morning when they left to die. Second thing that we have, which is extraordinary, is we have the bullets, which are forensic evidence. And the bullets of the Einsatzgruppen were different than the bullets of the gendarmerie. And the bullets of the Wehrmacht were different than the bullets of the Einsatzgruppen, and the bullets of the locals who killed their neighbors were also different. And we have what we cannot display are bodies, and the bodies also have forensic evidence because there are some bodies that have no wounds in them, which tells you that there are fathers who stepped between the bullets of their children, mothers who walked in front of their children to take a bullet for them, pushed them into the mass grave, and they didn't emerge. When we were building Washington, we had an extraordinary opportunity because we got the artifacts and the material from Eastern Europe, which allowed us to tell the story with authentic artifacts and to bring, as it were, a piece of Auschwitz to Washington. So therefore, we created with the railroad car, with the concentration camp barrack, we created with 5,000 pairs of shoes with human hair. We created with a facsimile of the gas chamber doors, with a facsimile of the dissecting table. And throughout the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we have about 10,000 different artifacts on display. But the difference in museum making is you do not use a museum to tell the story of the artifacts. You use the artifacts to tell the story of the event. Let me repeat it. You don't use a museum to tell the story of the artifacts. You use the artifacts to tell the story of the event. Different than an art museum. If I were to come to the art museum in Riga and give them 20 Picassos, they would develop a Picasso wing. If I gave them 10 Rembrandts, they would develop a Dutch masters collection, because the task of an art museum is to display the material that it has in a way that is compelling. The task of a historical museum is to tell a story. After you've answered the question, what, where, with what, then you have the question of design and technique, and that's the question how. And how now has to include an element that the museum has a double task. The museum has a task for those who enter its portals, and the museum has an equally important task for those who never enter its portals, but who visit it online. And the museum must also have what we call a takeaway, and there are new modalities of interaction with the material. There are new modalities of interaction with the material that allows the visitor to have an ongoing relationship with the institution on the internet, and also to bring material home from the internet. Let me give you 3 very simple examples. There is a museum in Philadelphia called the National Museum of American Jewish History, which tells the story of the immigrants' adjustment to the United States. The last single exhibit in the museum is a private booth in which the person who comes to that booth can tell their own story. That story is recorded. It is then sent home to them on internet and on email. And that means for children visiting and for young people visiting who are digitally literate, it means that it goes on Facebook and all of a sudden their 100 friends or their 50 friends or their 40 friends see the exhibition, raise the issue, can respond to it, and all of a sudden there's a conversation about what it means to migrate to America and what the adjustment was. But the museum becomes not a stagnant conversation, an ongoing conversation. At the museum in Brooklyn, you have a brand new technique in which iPads are given to people and they can create a diary of their interaction with all sorts of material, and the younger the visitor, the more they can interact with it. The diary then is sent home. The diary then can be updated and upgraded and interacted with on an ongoing basis and can be shared with the museum, and itself becomes an exhibition. You can do that with iPads, and now you can even do it with pens, because you now can get interactive pens that work, and Cooper Hewitt in New York gives you a pen with which you can do virtually everything you can do on an iPad, carrying nothing heavier than this. What's the dilemma? And this is the technique always with regard to technology, which is you never want the people to ooh and ah about the technology. You want them to be excited about the information that the technology allows them to encounter, and you want them to be able to be excited about what the technology allows them to learn and do and act and touch. And remember, part of the problem in a museum is normally in a museum you can't touch. And consequently, the idea that you can give people something to do is very important. Let me give my Israeli friends an example. Yad Vashem, for example, has a number of exhibitions that occur in drawers. And until Yad Vashem put on its drawers the sign, "Please open," nobody opened the drawers. Because you know, if you come to a human being's house, you can see anything they have on their shelf, you can see anything they have hanging on the wall, but if you open their drawers, you have violated their privacy. And chances are you will never be invited back again. So the idea that you have exhibitions in drawers, you have to tell the audience, "Please open," and all of a sudden you discover layer upon layer upon layer of information. And the important point is you want to give some people something they can do, most especially to the younger generation, which is used to an active modality. I can talk for weeks, and indeed I have, because I give long seminars on creating museums in architectural schools. But let me show you a little bit about what we did in Belgium, and the reason I do that is because those of you in Eastern Europe will have the opportunity to deal with the sites in which events actually occurred. And as you deal with the sites in which events actually occur, you have a responsibility both to preserve the site and to transmit the story of what happened on that site. And we'll see what we did at Belzec as part of that. Let's begin. This is the Soviet-era monument to Belzec. And the moment you put that monument up, they had marked Belzec, but it said very little, it offered very little, and consequently, only those who had a direct encounter with Belzec in terms of their family, only those who did that, who went off the beaten track, came to see Belzec. Belzec, just for one moment as an event, Belzec was a death camp, one of the 6 death camps, one of the Aktion Reinhardt death camps. It was opened between February 1942 and December 1942. 500,000 Jews were killed in Belzec. There were only 2 known survivors. Let me repeat that. 500,000 Jews were killed in Belzec. There were only 2 known survivors, of whom only one gave us testimony. The other was killed on the day that he was going to give testimony. So we only have the record of one person who went through the experience at Belzec. We, in fact, make that the centerpiece of Belzec. And the camp was in existence for essentially 10 months. During 2 of those months, they rebuilt the camp. And it was 99.99% effective in killing Jews. One other thing about Belzec, its staff of perpetrators was only 104, of whom 90 were Ukrainians. So you had 14 Germans involved in the total creation of the camp. We decided that what we would do would be to mark the entire site, and mark the entire site, including walling the site. And then we ran into, as we were designing, we ran into a piece of interesting luck, which is that we built with steel, and the steel began to rust and it began to drip. And when it rusted and dripped, it gave off the impression, ironically, of tears. And if you look at the site, and I'm sorry you don't have better view at this point, but we'll get you a better view. You look at the site, it marks, in essence, it marks the nature of the crime, and as you'll see it, there are 5 different sites of mass burial. Each of them is dark. There's industrial sludge to mark the site, very different, for example, than its sister camp of Treblinka. And those of you who have been to Treblinka know that Treblinka marks the victims, not the perpetrator and not the crime. This marks the crime. We use the ground, in essence, and the entranceway we used is metallic, with the idea that you have railroad tracks going in every direction, because we wanted to deal with the idea that people arrived in Belzec by railroad tracks. Within 2 hours, they were dead. And the railroad tracks give off the instance of that, and occasionally the railroad tracks form a Magen David, a Jewish star. We then had the question of what do you say and how do you say it in a few words, and we had 3 languages. So we said here on this site, 500,000 Jews were killed in 10 months in a process of industrialized killing. And this becomes the murderous site. It tells the story in one shot upon arrival. And even as a person who writes and has written 1,200-page books and the like, in museums, the absolute principle is that less is more. The fewer words, the more powerful the words, the more effective they are, and in memorial sites and museums, they do it. And if you look, again, part of it was not by design, but part of it was the beginning of a process of rust, which gives a sense of tears. We have, earth do not cover my blood, let there be no resting place for my outcry, Eretz al Chasiyat Damam. Essentially the quote from the book of Job. We then have a path. And the path goes down, and if you know the biblical citation, the notion of this is the opposite of the great splitting of the sea. In the splitting of the sea in the Bible, it says, "V'hachoma lahem miminam u'mismolam." There was a wall to the right and the left, which essentially protected the Israelites as they went on dry land. And here you begin to walk down, and the wall gets higher and higher and higher and higher. And you begin a journey toward an end. And the end is marked. And again, we had a very interesting thing that developed, and I'm sorry we don't have better sites. As we were thinking of a higher wall, we discovered that the steel rods that enable you to build walls and to have the walls stay were themselves came to make an artistic statement. And consequently, you always have to take advantage of when you run into luck. Sometimes you don't run into luck, but you run into luck, take advantage of it. And the designer and the architect had to begin to think anew. But if you think of the difference between this, for example, and the Vietnam Memorial Wall, the Vietnam Memorial Wall, you go down on one side, it gets higher and higher, but you're protected because you have nothing on the other side. It is, as it were, safe for you to encounter the names of those who were killed, because you do not have the sense of you're going through something from which there is no escape. This gives you a sense of the site, and with a sense of the site you can see that there is something awesome that happened here. What it is you don't fully know, but it gives you a sense of the site. This is the way in which we marked the area. And again, we marked the area in such a way that people cannot walk on the mass graves, and therefore they walk around it and above it and through it. And this gives you a sense of the wall and your own diminishment, and hence the sense of your own modesty and humility as you go through this. Another view of the same precise thing, which gives you again a sense of being overwhelmed by its power and its magnitude. We then use, instead of listing the full names of all the people who were victimized there, which is not available to us, we use the names of, first names of people, with the idea that for every Zelig there were hundreds, for every Menashe there were thousands, for every Avraham there were hundreds and thousands, etc., etc. And what also becomes remarkable as the visitor sees it is they point to their own names, especially because we use the combination of Polish and Jewish names. And this, by the way, Belzec was the burial place of the Jews from Galicia. So people who come from this have a sense of precisely what happened here. We also have only one element, Eretz al Chasiyat Damam, and look at the way in which the wall then is sculptured. So it looks like the wall itself has engaged in falling apart, in brokenness, in tears. The metaphor of the creation becomes a very powerful element. We then have something that is historically to ring the entire camp. We go, in Belzec, you can do it, unfortunately. We go day by day, week by week, month by month, city by city, deportation by deportation. So you can see on every step as you walk around the camp, you can see what community arrived on what day, and you know as you go through it that the community that arrived on that day then were destroyed precisely on that day, and you can see the nature of how much work there was in the camp as it began slowly in February, increased in March, stopped virtually in April, resumed in the middle of May, and then June, July, August, September 1942, overwhelming and massive. Community by community, and again, this also gives you an idea. And there's a little mark which separates out the month, so as you walk, you see the communities that went through this. We did a memorial sculpture to the railroad ties. And this is the railroad tracks. And this gives you a sense of the scope. And then what we did, which with this I'll conclude very rapidly, what we did then is to do what must be done, which is we created a mini museum that tells the story of what happened at Belzec. So we do not presume only to give you an emotional experience, we then give you an informative experience, which shapes what happened at Belzec, and we don't have to tell the story of the whole Holocaust, but we have to tell the story of the evolution of German policy in such a way that it leads to the creation of the Aktion Reinhardt camps, what then was unique about the Aktion Reinhardt camps, what then was unique about Belgium, and we tell the story in three motifs: the perpetrator and the crime, the victim and their experience, and the third, because this is a camp located within a community, the nature of the bystanders as well. We use documents, we use material, we use artifacts, and then we use a quote, which is a problematic quote, but a brilliant quote, which is the great poem by Don Pagis, which appears in 3 languages. Here in this carload I eve with my son Abel, if you can see my older boy Cain, the Son of Man, tell him I. And the reason it's problematic is because it says written in a pencil on a sealed rail car, and we're presenting a historical event, and this wasn't actually written on a pencil in a sealed railroad car. It was written by a very great poet who had very much to say in very few words, and consequently we wrestled with that issue most of all. This is the order for undressing, and that's the way in which we shaped Belzec, with the idea that you must preserve a site, you must tell what happened there on that site, but you can't presume that the emotional power of what you have to say will inform the visitor. You have to also take the trouble to inform the visitor of precisely what happened there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions? I must tell you that. Who? Can you come? It's very difficult for us to hear. Can you come over to ask you? Oh, microphone.
When did you create that memorial in Belzec, please?
When did we create it?
What year?
It is now 10 years old. And let me just say that it was an interesting cooperation between the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Polish government. And then the museum backed out of it at a given point, and the American Jewish Committee took it over. We ran an international competition for the design, and I created, with my colleagues, I created the museum. We didn't have a competition for the museum, and since I did it pro bono, they couldn't compete economically with it. But the idea was that we would create it. The other thing, in the center of the museum itself, we have the one testimony, which is the testimony of Rudolf Reder. And what we did is, and it should be said because the great actor Theodor Beckel agreed to narrate it if we presented it in Yiddish and not only in English and Hebrew, because the experience he felt was an experience that was experienced in Yiddish. And when he read it in Yiddish, my non-Jewish sound man who didn't understand the language did not break down when he read it in English, but broke down completely when he read it in Yiddish. Because the last statement on the testimony is, we heard a child saying, only when I heard a child saying, "Mother, it's dark, it's cold, I'm scared. Only then did we begin to cry. Later we stopped having feelings. And you have to imagine the Yiddish mamala. Once he read that, everybody lost it. And you hear the sheer magnitude of it. And again, we couldn't have access to Redder because he was in a pre-recording age. But we came as close as we could.
Thank you very much. It's a very deep psychological approach.